At my dad's funeral, my stepfather stood inches from me and demanded my $2 million inheritance. He said it like a business deal already closed. I remember the stunned silence in the crowd of uniforms and black suits, the smell of damp grass, the folded flag heavy in my arms. A daughter holding her father's memory, and a man I never trusted already reaching to take what was left of him. Hours later, I woke up in the military emergency room. My ribs screamed, my head rang, and the fluorescent lights above me blurred into one endless glare. The first thought that cut through the fog was not fear. It was anger. This was not grief anymore. This was war inside my own family. My name is Private First Class Emily Carson. I am 19 years old, a military police soldier still learning what it means to serve. But that day at Arlington, I learned what it means to fight for myself. People think funerals are about closure, about families putting differences aside for the sake of respect. They are not prepared for what happens when the family itself is the weapon. My stepfather, Randall Pierce, believed the day of burial would also be the day of conquest. My mother, Linda, stood beside him quiet, complicit, her hand resting on his arm as if to signal agreement. I felt my father's absence more sharply than ever, not just because the casket was draped in the flag, but because no one else in that family line intended to defend me. The voices that rose around me at the cemetery were not words of comfort. They were whispers that I was selfish, that I should share, that I should let Randall manage the estate because he was older and stronger. I remember thinking how absurd it was. I was the one in uniform. I was the one holding the folded flag against my chest, trembling from the sound of taps still echoing in the air. And yet, in their eyes, I was the child to be corrected. When I said no, it was not just a refusal. It was the first real boundary I had drawn in a lifetime of silence. I felt the ground shift under my boots. His eyes turned red. My mother's lips thinned. The guests around us stared as though they had witnessed a crime of disrespect. That night, the pain would come. The fists, the wall against my skull, the blackness that carried me from the cemetery to Walter Reed. But in that first moment at the graveside, the choice had already been made. I was no longer the quiet daughter. I was the soldier daring to protect her father's legacy. If this happened to you, would you stay silent, or would you fight back? The morning of the funeral at Arlington National Cemetery felt unreal from the first breath I took. The sky was an endless sheet of pale gray, not stormy, but heavy, as if the clouds themselves had chosen to stand at attention for my father. I pressed my palms against the stiff fabric of my dress uniform, the black armband cutting into my sleeve, the beret tight against my skull. My boots clicked against the stone path leading toward Section 60, where too many white headstones stretched like an army frozen forever. Each one stood perfectly straight, a formation that would never falter, rows upon rows that reminded me of both discipline and loss. The air carried the smell of cut grass and damp soil, and though I had marched on parade fields and stood guard outside barracks, nothing prepared me for this. This was not ceremony. This was blood and bone and memory. This was my father's final salute. I clutched the folded papers tucked in my breast pocket documents that confirmed what he had left behind. A trust account that held $2 million, a lake house in Texas overlooking Lake Travis, and a small collection of medals that once sat on his dresser. He had told me once that everything he owned would be mine when the time came, not because he wanted to burden me, but because he believed I had earned the right to protect it. He trusted me. In his eyes, I was not just his daughter. I was a soldier. That memory steadied me as I walked toward the gathered crowd, but the moment I saw Randall and my mother Linda standing near the front row, my resolve flickered. Randall's shoulders were squared like he owned the ground beneath him. He wore a black suit that strained at the seams, his tie crooked his jaw already tight with the same bitterness he carried into every room. Beside him, Linda wore a navy dress, pearls around her neck, and eyes that darted over me as though I were an inconvenience. No grief, no warmth, only calculation. I could feel it from 20 feet away. The honor guard was precise as they lifted the casket from the caisson, the horses shifting under the weight of the harness. The flag was stretched perfectly red, white, and blue, gleaming even in the muted light. The bugler raised the instrument, and the first mournful notes of taps carried across the rows of stone. My knees threatened to buckle. I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste blood because I refused to fall. My father's body was lowered into the ground with the dignity he had earned. Every fold of the flag, every step of the pallbearers, every command barked in crisp tones struck me like hammers. I pressed my hand against my chest, against the edge of the folded flag that would soon be mine, and I whispered silently that I would not let him down. Not now. Not ever. When the chaplain finished his words and the rifles fired the 3 volleys, I felt my stomach twist. The echoes bounced off the marble headstones and dissolved into silence. The honor guard turned with slow precision, each motion rehearsed yet so final it pierced me. One soldier stepped forward, knelt, and placed the folded flag into my arms. His voice carried strong and clear, "For your father's service." I held that weight against me, and in that moment I felt both honored and orphaned. Tears blurred the lines of the graves behind him, but I blinked them back because the eyes of the crowd were already on me. Randall cleared his throat and stepped closer, his hand brushing the microphone stand set up for family remarks. He had not earned a word here yet. Somehow he acted as though this platform belonged to him. His voice was thick, but loud enough to cut across the cemetery. "Family means legacy," he said, "and today we honor not just the man we bury, but the future he left us." My stomach tightened. The word "us" scraped like sandpaper. He spoke as if he were the rightful heir, as if my father's sweat and service had anything to do with him. Linda nodded at his side, her lips pressed into a faint smile, her hand curled around his sleeve as though to remind me she stood with him. The guests leaned forward. Some were veterans in uniform caps tucked under their arms. Others were neighbors from Texas people who remembered my father's barbecues and his Sunday fishing trips. A few were church members who had flown from Dallas. They all listened as Randall's voice swelled. He declared that I, Emily Carson, had agreed to let him manage the estate to take charge of the inheritance and property so it would be safe for the family. My heart slammed against my ribs. The folded flag nearly slipped from my grasp. "That is not true," I said, my voice carrying sharper than I intended. Heads turned, whispers flared, and the chaplain frowned as if I had disrupted sacred silence. Randall's face shifted into a mask of feigned sorrow. "Do not embarrass the family," Linda hissed under her breath, the microphone catching just enough to let the first row hear. Gasps fluttered through the crowd, some eyes filled with judgment, others with pity. A woman near the back shook her head and muttered that I should not be selfish. A man in uniform folded his arms, expression unreadable. My breath caught in my throat, but I forced it out again. My father left those things to me. "They are mine. I never agreed to your plan." The words cracked the air like a volley. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to freeze, only the weight of the flag against my arms, reminding me that I was still anchored. Randall's eyes burned. He gripped the stand until his knuckles whitened. The chaplain shifted uncomfortably. The honor guard looked away, disciplined silence masking their discomfort. I felt as though the earth beneath Arlington tilted. The very place meant to honor sacrifice had become a stage for betrayal. My father's grave was barely sealed, and already his wishes were under attack. I clutched the flag tighter, my nails digging into the fabric, my mind screaming that I would not let them rewrite his legacy. Around me, the whispers rose again, selfish, dramatic, difficult, the same labels I had carried since childhood. My lips trembled, but I stood my ground. I was not just a daughter. I was a soldier. And this was the first battle of a war I never asked for, but could not walk away from. The service ended, but the weight of eyes on me did not fade. Guests filed slowly toward the reception tent set up near the visitor center, their murmurs blending with the sound of gravel under shoes. The flag still rested in my arms, the corners pressing into my ribs like anchors, and every step felt heavier than the last. I had imagined walking away from Arlington with quiet dignity, remembering my father's life, maybe sharing stories about his deployments and the stubborn way he always believed in fixing things himself. Instead, I carried not only grief, but the sharp sting of being publicly cornered by Randall. I could still hear Linda's whisper as if she were breathing against my ear. Do not embarrass us. Her choice of words revealed everything. It was not about my father, not about honor, not even about family. It was about control, about saving face, about reminding me that in her world, my duty was to remain silent. As I crossed the lawn toward the line of parked cars, I caught fragments of conversations. One older cousin remarked that I should have kept quiet for the sake of peace. Another guest muttered that $2 million was too much responsibility for someone my age. Their words carved into me like cold steel, each assumption a dismissal of who I was and what I had already endured. I wanted to shout that I was not a child, that I wore this uniform because I had earned it, that I had spent nights patrolling gates and learning procedures that demanded discipline most of them could not imagine. But my jaw locked. The silence I kept was not agreement. It was survival until the moment I could strike back with proof. The reception space was polished and somber. Rows of chairs and tables covered in white cloth stood under the tent trays of food, untouched pitchers of water sweating in the humidity. A memorial display with photographs of my father had been placed on an easel near the entrance. I paused before it, tracing the edge of one frame with my eyes. In one photo, he stood in uniform at a base in Germany, sunlight glinting off his medals, his smile broad and proud. In another, he knelt beside me as a child, guiding my hand as I tried to hold his service pistol unloaded and safe, teaching me respect rather than fear. Those images steadied me. He had believed in me. He had trusted that I would carry his values even after he was gone. That memory burned bright as I turned and faced the room of whispering relatives and watchful neighbors. Randall wasted no time. He planted himself near the center table, his voice rising as though the funeral had been his stage and this tent his encore. He thanked everyone for coming, praised my father's life in phrases so hollow they rattled, then pivoted seamlessly into talk of legacy. He spoke about managing finances, about protecting family assets, about guiding Lily and Chase into stable futures. Every word was laced with the assumption that he, not I, was the rightful steward of what my father had built. Linda hovered at his side, nodding her eyes occasionally, flicking to me as if daring me to object again. I stood near the back flag, pressed tight to my chest, my heart pounding against the fabric. Anger built with every sentence he uttered. My father's voice echoed in memory, reminding me that property was not just walls and windows, but years of sweat, late nights, and sacrifices. He had told me that the lake house in Texas was a sanctuary he wanted me to keep because he knew I would need a place untouched by judgment. And now Randall twisted that gift into something communal, a resource to be seized. My throat ached, but I forced myself to step forward. "That is not yours," I said, each word deliberate. Gasps rippled again. Conversations stilled. Randall's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as though I had spat on sacred ground. Linda leaned closer to him, whispering with a smile that never reached her eyes. For a moment, silence pressed heavy across the tent. Then someone near the buffet table coughed and muttered that I was too young to understand responsibility. Another voice said $2 million could disappear quickly if mishandled. The murmurs swelled a tide of doubt that threatened to drown me. My pulse raced, but I stood straighter. "I may be 19, I said louder, "but I am a soldier. I am not reckless. My father trusted me." "He trusted me, not you." The words cracked like thunder. Some faces in the crowd softened with uncertainty. Others hardened with judgment. Randall stepped closer until his shadow crossed mine. His breath smelled faintly of liquor, though it was barely noon. He hissed through clenched teeth that this was not the place to fight. But his tone carried threat, not restraint. I clutched the flag tighter, every muscle in my body taut, every instinct screaming that danger was closer than anyone realized. He turned back to the guests, forcing a laugh, insisting that grief made people speak harshly, that everything would be settled quietly in time. The room exhaled uneasily, but I saw the flicker in his eyes. This was no retreat. It was postponement. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting with both fear and fury. The tense ceiling pressed low, the air thick with heat and whispers. I felt like a cornered animal, a soldier stripped of her weapon, relying only on voice and resolve. In that instant, I realized what this day had become. It was not only about burying my father, it was about whether I would bury myself in silence. And I knew I would not. Hours later, I would wake in the military emergency room, pain blooming through every inch of my body. But standing in that reception tent at Arlington, I understood the battle lines had already been drawn. He wanted my inheritance. He wanted control. My mother wanted my compliance, and the crowd wanted me to fold. Yet beneath the weight of their stares, I felt a different fire rising. For the first time in years, I was not shrinking. I was expanding. I was preparing. The reception tent buzzed with the low hum of uneasy voices, but before I could even find a chair, Randall decided the stage was his again. He struck his glass against the edge of the table until the sound pierced the murmurs and conversations snapped shut like doors. Every eye turned toward him, some expectant, some wary, all waiting. He cleared his throat, straightened his shoulders, and spoke as though the microphone had been placed there for his personal announcement. My father's body had not been in the ground 2 hours yet. Randall spoke not of love, not of sacrifice, but of control. He said that my father's estate had always been meant to serve the family as a whole, and he announced with a confidence that froze my blood that I had already agreed to let him manage the assets. He emphasized the words manage and protect, framing himself as a guardian instead of a thief, but every syllable dripped with entitlement. The words landed with weight, and for a moment the silence that followed almost convinced the crowd it was fact. Heads nodded slightly. A few guests even began to clap their faces, glowing with relief that a man was taking charge. I felt heat rise in my chest. The folded flag cut into my forearms as I clutched it tighter. I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the air. That is not true. I never agreed to that. My declaration sliced through the room like a blade. Whispers flared, instantly sharp and ugly. A cousin muttered that I should not ruin the day. A woman in a black veil leaned to her neighbor and hissed that I was ungrateful. Linda's lips barely moved as she leaned toward the microphone. "Do not embarrass us," she whispered, but the amplification caught just enough to carry. A few people gasped. Others lowered their eyes, unwilling to choose sides. My throat felt raw, but I forced the words out again. My father's estate is mine. He trusted me, and I will not surrender it. Randall's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing to slits. He forced a smile toward the crowd and pretended to calm the storm. "Grief makes people emotional," he said, as though I were a child throwing a tantrum. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, squeezing hard enough that pain shot down my arm, and turned back to the guests with a chuckle. "We will sort this out quietly later. There is no need to trouble anyone else." His grip felt like a clamp. I shrugged it off and stepped back, my boots scraping against the floor, the sound loud in the hush. My hands shook, but I refused to let the flag slip. Every instinct told me to leave, to walk out and breathe air that was not poisoned by lies, but leaving would have meant surrender. Instead, I planted my feet. My eyes burned into his until he looked away. The tent filled with uneasy coughs and shuffling. Some guests tried to change the subject, moving toward the food, pretending nothing had happened. Others leaned in closer, hungry for drama. I saw phones raised discreetly, cameras glinting the glow of screens, capturing every second. I knew then that whatever happened here would not remain private. The whispers would spread, the recordings would leak, and the world would see the truth. For once, the silence I had been buried under my whole life would be broken. Randall's expression hardened. He took a step closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "You are making a mistake, Emily. You do not know what you are doing." His words were cold, not warning, but promise. My heart pounded so loud I thought the entire tent could hear. I lifted my chin. I know exactly what I am doing. I am protecting what is mine. His eyes flickered with rage, the kind of rage that had no boundary. I realized then that this would not end with words. He had chosen his battlefield, and I had chosen to stand on it. The rest was inevitable. The chaplain tried to interject, offering a prayer for peace, but his voice was drowned out by the rising storm. Randall turned back to the crowd, his smile fixed but brittle. He repeated that I was too young, too emotional, that he only wanted to keep the estate safe for everyone. Linda nodded, adding softly that family comes first, that sacrifice was expected. The chorus of whispers rose again. Selfish, difficult, disrespectful. Each word hammered into me, but I refused to bend. My voice cracked out one more time, sharp as steel. I said no. I will not hand over what my father left me. The tent fell silent again. Faces shifted expressions torn between sympathy and disdain. For the first time, I saw not just judgment, but fear flicker in a few eyes. Fear that they were witnessing something that would not be forgotten, something that would unravel this family in front of them. I stood with the flag pressed to my chest, trembling but unyielding the weight of generations on my shoulders. Randall's mask slipped completely then. His smile vanished, his face flushed, his fists clenched. He did not speak, not in that moment. He simply stared at me as though he could burn me into ash with his eyes alone. The air thickened, suffocating every breath a battle. And in that suspended silence, I understood that the public ambush had only just begun. The moment stretched so long I could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights under the tent canopy, the sound of a chair scraping against gravel, the soft sniffle of someone in the back row. Then Randall moved. He pulled a manila envelope from his suit jacket and slapped it down on the table with a flourish that made the pitchers of water tremble. His voice rang loud, clear, calculated for drama. Since Emily is young and grieving, I have prepared the necessary documents to help her transition responsibility. His hand tapped the envelope. These papers will allow me to manage the estate, the accounts, the property. Nothing will be lost. Everything will be safe. He paused for effect, sweeping the crowd with a gaze that dared anyone to object. For a second, I thought perhaps no one would. I felt my knees weaken under the weight of expectation, the silent pressure to comply. I imagined myself signing, disappearing, shrinking into the obedient shadow my mother had always wanted me to be. But then I tightened my grip on the folded flag, the fabric stiff beneath my fingers, and I remembered my father's voice. "You are stronger than they know." That memory steadied me. I stepped forward, heart-hammering, and said with all the force I had left, "I will not sign anything. That estate is mine by my father's will and by his trust in me." A collective gasp broke across the room. A glass shattered on the floor. Someone muttered that I was ungrateful. Another whispered that this was shameful. But I also heard a different sound, the faint click of a phone camera, the glow of a screen angled toward us. Evidence, I thought. Proof. Randall's face darkened. He tore the envelope open and pulled out the papers, waving them like banners. "See how selfish she is," he barked. "See how she refuses to let her family thrive." He turned toward me, his voice low and venomous. "Sign the paper, Emily. Sign it now before you regret this." My chest tightened, but I shook my head. "I am not afraid of you," I whispered. But I was afraid. My hands trembled, my breath came sharp and shallow, my stomach churned, yet even in fear there was resolve. "I would not betray my father by surrendering to this farce." Randall slammed the papers down again, his fist leaving a dent in the wood. The sound made guests flinch. Linda stepped forward, then her voice pitched in a tone that pretended sweetness but dripped with accusation. "Your father wanted the family cared for. Do you think he would want you hoarding money while your sister struggles? Do you think he would want Chase without support?" Her words stung because they twisted truth into weapon. My father had loved them, yes, but he had also trusted me, specifically me, with his legacy. That trust mattered more than their manipulation. I lifted my chin and met her eyes. My father wanted me to stand on my own. That is what I am doing. The tent grew restless. Some guests avoided my gaze, retreating into safe silence. Others leaned forward, fascinated by the collision they could not look away from. A man in uniform shifted uncomfortably, his jaw clenched as though he wanted to intervene, but knew it was not his place. The chaplain tried once more to calm the room, asking everyone to remember the sanctity of the day, but his words dissolved into the tension like smoke into storm clouds. The real battle had begun, and nothing would stop it now. Randall grabbed the papers again and shoved them toward me, his voice loud enough to echo off the canvas walls. "Sign it, Emily. This is your last chance." His hand hovered inches from my chest, the documents quivering with the force of his grip. My body screamed to step back, but my boots rooted into the ground. I forced my voice steady. "No." The word was small, but it carried like thunder. It was the same word I had practiced silently my whole life, but never dared to speak aloud. And in that instant, it was more powerful than any punch. The crowd gasped again. The whispers roared. Selfish, strong, foolish, brave. I heard them all, a storm of contradiction, but none of it mattered. I had said no, and nothing could erase it. Randall's eyes blazed. His chest heaved. He crumpled the papers in his fist and threw them onto the floor. The envelope burst open, scattering pages across the ground like feathers torn from a bird. Some guests stooped to gather them. Others stepped back as though afraid the conflict might spill over into their laps. My mother pressed a hand to her forehead, shaking her head as though I had committed some unthinkable crime. She whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "You are destroying this family." The irony hit me like a blow. I wanted to shout back that the family had been rotting for years, that I was the one trying to preserve a shred of dignity, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just tightened my hold on the flag until my knuckles whitened and stared at the mess of papers on the ground. Randall's voice dropped to a growl only I could hear. "You will regret this. I promise you that." His breath smelled of whiskey, his eyes bloodshot, his hand trembling, not from grief, but from fury. My stomach dropped, my skin prickled, and I knew what would come next would not be words. He was done with performance. He was ready for violence. And though fear clenched my gut, a strange calm also settled over me. I had made my choice. Whatever came would not erase it. The crowd around us shifted uneasily, some filming, some whispering, all sensing the inevitable. The public ambush was complete. The next step would be the strike. The tension inside the reception tent had reached a pitch that felt like it could split the canvas above our heads. I stood clutching the folded flag against my chest, my pulse rattling like drumfire in my ears as Randall's shadow loomed closer. His eyes were wild pupils, sharp pinpoints in the redness of drink and rage. The crumpled papers at his feet lay scattered like confetti from a parade gone wrong. Proof that this day had never been about honoring my father, but about seizing power in his absence. The guests shifted restlessly, some leaning forward with morbid curiosity, others retreating toward the edges of the tent. Phones were still raised. I saw one young man holding his device high above the crowd, the red glow of a recording light undeniable. My skin prickled with awareness that this moment would not remain confined to Arlington. What happened here would travel, multiply, and shape every perception of who I was and who Randall had always been. He moved fast, faster than I expected for a man his size. His hand shot out and gripped my upper arm, the strength in his fingers crushing muscle to bone. Pain flared instantly, sharp and hot. "Sign the papers," he hissed again, his face so close I could see the veins pulsing in his temple. I tried to wrench free, but his grip only tightened. A murmur rose from his crowd, some guests gasping, others whispering that it had gone too far. Linda's voice pierced the noise high and sharp. "Randall, please not here." But she did not move to stop him. She only wrung her hands and looked around as though hoping someone else would intervene. No one did. I squared my shoulders, forcing air into my lungs despite the pressure on my arm. "I will not." I said the words cracking, but firm. The folded flag pressed harder against my ribs, the last barrier between his hand and my heart. His eyes narrowed further, and I knew in that instant that words were finished. His fist came out of nowhere, a brutal arc that connected with my abdomen just below the sternum. The air shot from my lungs in a single ragged gasp. I bent forward instinctively, arms clamping tighter around the flag, as if it were the only anchor keeping me upright. White light burst behind my eyes. I staggered back, boots sliding on the floor of the tent. Gasps exploded. A chair toppled. Someone screamed. For a heartbeat, all I heard was the thundering rush of my own pulse. I tried to straighten, tried to pull air back into my lungs, but my body refused. Randall's hand struck again this time, shoving hard against my shoulder. My back slammed into the tent pole canvas, shuddering with the impact. Pain shot up my spine and ricocheted through my skull as my head cracked against the wooden frame. I cried out, though the sound was faint even to my own ears. The world tilted, blurred a smear of faces and colors. I felt myself sliding downward, knees folding the folded flag, slipping slightly in my arms. My hands scrambled desperately to keep hold of it, even as my strength drained away. I could not drop it. I could not let my father's symbol fall into the dirt while Randall stood above me. The crowd surged in conflicting directions, some rushing forward, others stumbling back in panic. Voices overlapped in a cacophony of shock. He hit her. "Call someone! Stop this!" A crash rang out as a tray of glasses shattered on the floor. My vision narrowed to a tunnel, the edges darkening. A sharp metallic taste filled my mouth. I coughed and felt wetness streak my lips. Somewhere nearby, I heard the click of a camera shutter, then another proof multiplying in real time. I tried to lift my head, but the weight was unbearable. The last thing I saw before the darkness surged fully was Randall standing over me, chest heaving, his face twisted in triumph and fury. The sight seared itself into me, a memory that would never fade. Then the world snapped away. When consciousness flickered again, it was chaos. Sirens wailed, faintly distant at first, then closer, louder, shrill against the backdrop of murmured voices. My body shifted, lifted, carried. Straps tightened across my chest, pinning me to a hard surface. Cold air brushed against my face. I fought to open my eyes, but could barely manage slivers of light. Red and blue streaks blurred across my vision. Someone's hands pressed against my temple gauze, soaking warmth that I realized was blood. "Stay with us, Emily," a voice commanded, sharp and urgent. "Do not close your eyes." I wanted to answer, but only a weak rasp slipped through. My chest burned with every shallow breath, pain radiating outward like cracks in glass. The ceiling above me was white, featureless, rushing by in jerks as wheels clattered beneath. Another voice, lower, steadier, said, "Concussion, possible abdominal trauma. Keep her airway clear." A mask pressed over my nose and mouth, cool oxygen rushing in, making me cough. I tried to move, but straps held me firm. Panic clawed at me, but exhaustion pinned me deeper. All I could do was listen. The siren's cry, the steady beep of a monitor, the clipped commands of paramedics. Then, like a lighthouse through fog, one thought pierced the haze. This was not the end. I would not let it be the end. They had tried to take my father's legacy through lies and now through violence, but they had made a mistake. They had struck me in front of witnesses, in front of cameras, in front of the world. That red recording light I had glimpsed would become the weapon they never anticipated. I clung to that thought like rope, forcing myself to stay tethered even as darkness dragged again at the edges. My lips formed words, though no sound came. Not the end. Not the end. The last thing I remember before the sirens faded into a low hum was the sudden shift of the gurney up into the ambulance, the slam of doors shutting out the noise of the crowd, and the overwhelming knowledge that when I opened my eyes again, I would be somewhere else, somewhere sterile, somewhere I would have to gather every ounce of strength left. Walter Reed awaited, and so did the next chapter of this war. The first thing I noticed when I came back was the sound. A high, steady beeping that cut through the fog like a metronome, refusing to let me drift away. Then light white and piercing, stabbing at my eyes until I flinched and turned my head. My skull throbbed as though it had been split with an axe. The smell of antiseptic filled my nose, sharp and sterile, and beneath it a faint trace of something metallic that made my stomach twist. I realized slowly that I was not lying on grass or canvas, but on a narrow bed surrounded by machines. Straps still crossed my chest and waist, keeping me steady. My uniform jacket had been cut open, the edges ragged, my undershirt stained where blood had soaked through. An IV line trailed from my arm to a clear bag above fluid dripping steadily into my veins. A nurse leaned over her expression, focused yet calm. "Concussion, abdominal bruising," she said briskly, as if cataloging damage. We are monitoring you for internal bleeding. Try not to move." Her voice carried authority but also urgency. I opened my mouth, but my throat felt like sandpaper. A rasp escaped, barely a word. "Where?" She leaned closer. "Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. Bethesda. You are safe now. Safe." The word rattled in my head. How could I be safe when the man who struck me was still free? I tried to lift my hand, but pain lanced up my ribs. The nurse pressed gently on my shoulder. "Rest. Let us work." Another voice entered, then firm and commanding. I turned my head and saw PFC Maya Lopez, my fellow military police trainee, standing near the door. Her dark hair was pulled back tight, her uniform immaculate even in the chaos of the ER. Her eyes softened when they met mine. "Emily, you scared the hell out of us." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Someone caught everything on video. It is already spreading." I blinked confusion, battling with exhaustion. "Video?" She nodded, pulling her phone from her pocket and showing me the screen. Even blurred by pain, I recognized the scene, Randall's fist driving into me, my body crumpling, the crowd gasping. The clip had already been uploaded to social media. A red banner at the top read, "Breaking." My breath caught a mix of humiliation and vindication. They could not bury this now. It was out there. Maya slipped the phone back into her pocket and placed a hand lightly on the rail of my bed. "You do not have to fight alone anymore." I wanted to answer, but tears welled instead, hot and unbidden, sliding down into my hairline. I closed my eyes briefly, letting them fall, then forced myself to breathe through the ache. "This is not the end." I whispered the words so faint I barely heard them. Maya leaned in. "No, it is the beginning." The curtain shifted and a doctor entered, tablet in hand. He introduced himself quickly, then checked my pupils with a small penlight, making me wince. "Reflexes sluggish but present," he murmured, jotting notes. He explained that I had a concussion, a contusion across the ribs, and 6 stitches above my temple. No fractures, no internal bleeding detected so far, but observation would continue. His tone was clinical yet weighted. "Blows like that can be fatal. You were fortunate." The word fortunate stung. There was nothing fortunate about being beaten at my own father's funeral. But I bit the thought back, storing it deep, saving it for later. When the doctor left the room, seemed quieter, though the beeping and footsteps of staff still filled the air. I turned my head toward Maya again. "Does he know what he has done?" She nodded grimly. "Randall. Everyone knows now. It is on the local news already." Her voice hardened. "And the colonel knows too." My pulse quickened. "Colonel Whitaker." She nodded again. "He called me personally when he saw the footage. He asked me to stay with you until you woke up." Relief and fear tangled in my chest. The colonel was not just authority. He was law within the army, and if he was involved, this was no longer a family argument. It was official. I lay there, staring at the sterile ceiling tiles, every beep of the monitor pounding like a drumbeat. Pain radiated through my chest, with each breath my temple pulsing with the rhythm of stitches. Yet beneath it all, a fire had begun to burn. They thought they could silence me with fists. They thought fear would bend me. But all they had done was provide evidence stronger than anything I could have gathered alone. My father's legacy was not lost. It was defended in blood and bandages, and the proof was now in the hands of the world. Another nurse entered briefly, adjusting the IV and murmuring encouragement. I closed my eyes again, exhaustion pulling at me. But before darkness claimed me, I clutched the edge of the blanket and whispered to myself, "This fight is mine, and I will not lose it." The hours blurred in the white glare of Walter Reed. Machines hummed steadily at my bedside, the rhythm of the monitors becoming the drumbeat of my consciousness. Nurses came and went, adjusting IV lines, checking vitals, scribbling notes on charts. I was too disoriented to read. I lay there, ribs aching with every breath, the stitches on my temple pulling each time I shifted against the pillow. The folded flag rested on the cabinet beside me, still crisp, still perfect, a reminder of why I was here. I reached for it once in the dark hours of early morning, my fingers brushing the starched cotton, and whispered into the silence that I would not let my father's trust be stolen. The pain reminded me I was still alive, and being alive meant I still had a fight to finish. Maya sat with me through most of it, her presence quiet but grounding. She told me between visits from doctors that the video had gone viral. She scrolled through her phone to show me headlines: Army MP assaulted by stepfather at Arlington, stepdad attacks soldier at father's funeral, inheritance dispute turns violent. Each headline twisted my stomach tighter. I hated the exposure, hated that my pain was now fodder for strangers, yet I also felt a spark of grim satisfaction. Randall could not bury this under charm or intimidation. The world had already seen who he was. I asked if the police had been called, and Maya nodded. Arlington jurisdiction meant local law enforcement had responded, and because I was a service member, the Army's Judge Advocate General Corps was already reviewing the case. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "The Colonel is watching this carefully," he said to rest. I tried to smile, but it felt weak stretched across bruises that throbbed each time I moved my mouth. Rest felt impossible with the weight of so many eyes on me. At night, when the ward grew quieter, my thoughts turned to my father. I remembered sitting with him by Lake Travis, the warm Texas sun glittering off the water, the way he skipped stones and teased me when mine sank instantly. He had told me then, long before illness had carved hollows into his frame, that strength was not measured by fists or shouting, but by how you stood when the world tried to push you down. He had laughed softly and said I would learn that lesson sooner than I wanted. I never realized he was warning me of this exact moment. Tears stung my eyes as I remembered his last weeks, the rasp in his breath, the determination in his gaze when he told me about the estate. "You are my daughter, Emily. You protect what is ours. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." I held on to those words now like a shield. The morning after the assault, a detective from Arlington Police arrived. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, his expression professional but sympathetic. He asked for my account, and though my voice trembled, I gave it. Every detail. The words tasted bitter, but they flowed. I told him about the announcement, the false claims, the pressure, the envelope of papers, the threats, the blows. He listened without interruption, only nodding occasionally, jotting quick notes. When I finished, he closed his notebook and said simply, "We have enough. There are multiple witnesses, video evidence, and your injuries confirm assault. Randall Pierce will be charged." Relief washed through me, cool and fleeting, but beneath it ran fear. Charged was not convicted. He was still free, at least for now. He still had access to my mother, to their allies, to resources I could not match. I clenched the edge of the blanket with weak fingers and promised myself that I would not rest until accountability was sealed. Later that day, Colonel Whitaker himself visited. His uniform was impeccable, his presence commanding even in the quiet ward. He stood at the foot of my bed, his expression serious, his voice steady. "Carson, you have the Army's support. What happened to you was unacceptable." He explained that the JAG office would coordinate with civilian authorities, that my rights as a soldier had been violated, and that any attempt to coerce or intimidate me into signing away property would be treated with the full weight of federal law. His words steadied me in ways the IV could not. For the first time since my father's funeral, I felt the faint stirrings of safety. I thanked him, my voice hoarse but firm, and he inclined his head before leaving as quickly as he had come. The gesture was brief, but it mattered. I was not alone. The hours bled into one another. Pain became background noise, sharp when I coughed or shifted, but constant enough to be familiar. Nurses taught me how to breathe through it, short, shallow breaths, slow movements. Maya updated me on the outside world. News anchors debated the morality of inheritance battles. Strangers online argued in comment threads about selfishness and justice. Some mocked me for standing against my family. Others praised me for refusing to yield. The words stung and soothed in equal measure. I was no longer invisible. My story had escaped the suffocating walls of silence, and though exposure burned, it also lit the path forward. One evening, as the sky outside turned the color of steel, I sat propped against pillows holding the folded flag across my lap. The monitor beeped steadily beside me, the IV hissed faintly, but I felt almost calm. I whispered to my father's memory, telling him what had happened, telling him what I would do next. They tried to take what you gave me, I said softly. They thought they could shame me, hurt me, silence me. But I am still here, and I will not stop until the truth is written in their ruin. My words trembled but carried conviction. The fight was not over. It was only beginning. The second night at Walter Reed was worse than the first because now the shock had worn off and pain filled every space it could find. My ribs throbbed with each breath, my head ached with every flicker of light from the monitor, and the knowledge of what had happened replayed in an endless loop that robbed me of rest. I closed my eyes, but I kept seeing Randall's fist, the snap of his arm, the gasps of the crowd, the blurred ceiling rushing past as paramedics wheeled me out of Arlington. Sleep came in shallow bursts, chased away by the sting of memory. Yet even in exhaustion, I refused to surrender. Each time I woke, I whispered the same words to myself, a vow etched deeper with repetition. This is not the end. They thought violence would end me. It will be the proof that saves me. By morning, the ward was already buzzing. A television mounted high in the corner played news on low-volume captions scrolling across the screen. I blinked and forced my eyes to focus. The words felt surreal. Funeral assault at Arlington. Sparks outrage. Soldier attacked over inheritance. I watched my own body collapse in grainy footage captured on a guest's phone, the crowd screaming Randall towering above me. The nurse adjusted my IV and glanced at the screen before muttering, "Shameful." She caught my eye and added, "You do not deserve this." That small acknowledgement mattered more than she could have known. Too often, people had looked away, chosen silence. Now, even strangers were willing to call the truth by its name. Maya returned mid-morning carrying a small notebook and a cup of coffee she set carefully on the table. She perched on the chair beside my bed, her presence steady. "You are everywhere," she said, flipping the notebook open. "CNN local stations, even military forums. People are furious." She showed me printed headlines, screenshots of tweets, comments from veterans calling Randall a disgrace. I felt a flicker of satisfaction but also dread. Public attention could cut both ways, Cal. It could bring protection, but it could also bring retaliation. I voiced the thought aloud, and Maya nodded soberly. "That is why the Colonel is pressing JAG to act fast. They cannot let this fade into noise. Too many eyes are watching now." In the afternoon, a detective returned with more questions. He asked me again to recount the sequence, clarifying times and phrases. I gave him everything I remembered, though my voice faltered when I described the impact of Randall's fist. He nodded, scribbling notes, then confirmed that formal charges had been filed: aggravated assault, attempted coercion, and reckless endangerment. He assured me that Randall's travel was being monitored, that he would be arrested once the paperwork cleared. Relief spread through me, but I also felt hollow. Arrest was only the start. Trials dragged. Families manipulated. I knew Randall and Linda would not accept defeat quietly. The detective must have sensed my unease because he added, "We will not let him spin this. Too many witnesses, too much video. Trust me, this is not going away." When he left, I lay staring at the folded flag again, its sharp edges silhouetted against the pale wall. I thought of my mother, her pearls glinting, her voice steady as she defended Randall, her eyes cold when she told me not to embarrass the family. That betrayal cut deeper than Randall's fists. He was violent, yes, but she was complicit. She chose silence. She chose him. My chest tightened, pain mixing with grief, but beneath it, something else stirred. Anger, sharp and clarifying. They had underestimated me all my life. They thought 19 years old meant naive, powerless, breakable, but I was still standing, and I was no longer alone. That evening, Maya placed her phone on the tray table and hit play on a video. It was a clip circulating online, an edited montage showing my father's funeral. Randall's announcement, my refusal, and finally the assault. Text overlaid across the screen read, "She said no." The video had been shared thousands of times. Comments scrolled beneath, "Stay strong, soldier justice for Emily boundaries, our survival." My throat tightened, eyes stinging as I realized strangers were speaking the words I had whispered to myself in the dark. This was bigger than me now. My story had become a mirror for others who had been silenced. That realization gave me strength even as tears blurred the screen. Later, after Maya left for the night, I whispered aloud, though no one was there to hear. They think they buried me, but they only planted me. The machines beeped softly, oxygen hissed, and I repeated the vow again louder this time. I will fight back. Not just for the inheritance, not just for my father, for every time they tried to make me smaller, for every time they demanded silence, for everyone who has been told family means obedience. My ribs ached with the effort, but I forced the words out until my throat burned. It felt like breathing life into something larger than myself. I drifted into uneasy sleep with that vow on my lips. And when morning came again, pale light slanting through the blinds, I knew with clarity what had to happen. This was no longer just about healing. This was about exposing them completely. If they wanted war, I would give it to them. But this time, every blow would land in the open, every secret dragged into light, every betrayal stamped into record. The battle was only beginning, and I was ready. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, in a house that never really felt like mine. From the outside, it looked ordinary enough, a 2-story brick home with a trimmed yard and a swing set that rusted before anyone thought to oil the chains. But inside, the walls hummed with tension. My father, Daniel Carson, a Vietnam veteran, carried both discipline and warmth. He believed in structure, yes, but he also believed in laughter and fishing trips and Sunday afternoons, tinkering with an old Chevy just to show me how to use a wrench. He told me stories about his service not to glorify war, but to explain sacrifice. He wanted me to understand that honor was not something you inherited, but something you earned. Those moments with him were the only times I felt fully seen. With him, my laughter mattered. My questions mattered. My stubborn streak made him smile instead of scowl. With my mother, Linda, everything was different. Linda Pierce was a woman who believed appearances were currency. She decorated every corner of our house to impress guests, polished silverware that was never used, and carried herself with the cool detachment of someone who valued reputation above connection. She remarried Randall when I was 11, and from the first day he stepped into our home, the air shifted. He was loud, commanding, convinced that his opinion carried the weight of gospel. He favored Chase, his son, from a previous marriage, and together they formed a unit that made me feel like the unwanted guest in my own home. Randall often joked that girls should stick to cheerleading, not soldiers' boots. Linda laughed lightly each time, never defending me. At dinner, if I spoke about joining JROTC, Randall rolled his eyes. Chase smirked. Linda sipped her wine and changed the subject. Slowly and visibly, my place at the table shrank until silence felt safer than words. By the time I reached high school, the fracture lines were permanent. My father's health began to falter. He coughed more, moved slower, and spent more time at the VA hospital. Agent Orange, he muttered one night, his voice rough as gravel. Years later, it would be confirmed lung cancer, the shadow that had haunted so many veterans of his era. I sat by his bedside through treatments, watching the man who had once taught me how to skip stones struggle to catch his breath. Linda visited, yes, but always with an air of impatience, as though the hospital interfered with her social calendar. Randall rarely came. When he did, he filled the room with his booming voice, talking over the doctors, dismissing my father's choices, hinting at how poorly finances were being managed. I clenched my fists each time, biting my tongue, until blood filled my mouth because arguing only drew Linda's icy reprimands. Respect your stepfather. Do not cause scenes. It was during those years that my father urged me toward the Army. He knew my restlessness, my hunger for purpose, and he believed the structure would both protect and sharpen me. He told me to join the military police to learn the law inside and out so no one could ever twist it against me. I listened. I enrolled. I trained. When I shipped out for basic, he hugged me longer than he ever had, whispering that he was proud. That word lodged deep in me, a rare jewel I carried even on the hardest nights of training. But while my world was expanding in uniform at home, the lines tightened. Randall gained more influence. Linda leaned on him for every decision, from bills to holidays. Chase strutted through the house as if ownership had already shifted. When I came home on leave, they treated me like a visitor, not a daughter. My father's voice grew weaker, but his resolve did not. He updated his will, leaving the Lake Travis house and $2 million in savings directly to me. He said it in front of me, his voice firm, even through coughing fits. "Emily, this is yours. You protect it. Do not let anyone bully you out of it." Randall's jaw had tightened when he heard Linda's lips had pressed into a line, and Chase stormed out of the room. I knew then the battle lines had been drawn. When my father finally passed, the funeral at Arlington was both an honor and a wound. He had chosen it himself, wanting to be laid to rest among comrades, a soldier among soldiers. But even in that sacred space, Randall and Linda could not resist. They looked at the inheritance not as memory, but as prize. And I, the daughter they had dismissed, became the obstacle in their path. By the time I turned 18, the divide at home was an open canyon. I returned from Fort Leonard Wood after completing my initial training with my uniform pressed and my boots polished, proud of the rank stitched onto my chest. But when I stepped into the house in Dallas, Randall barely looked up from his glass of bourbon. He grunted that I should have gone to college instead of playing soldier. Linda kissed my cheek lightly, then turned to fuss over Chase's grades, ignoring the sweat and effort that still clung to me from training. I sat at the dinner table in silence while Randall spoke about business opportunities, about contracts he was pursuing with construction firms tied to government projects, about how Chase would one day run things. My presence was treated as an interruption. I chewed slowly, my jaw aching from the weight of unspoken words. Later that night, sitting on the edge of my bed in the guest room they now insisted I use, I promised myself that I would never again measure my worth by their indifference. Still, the moments with my father before he passed kept echoing. He had looked me in the eye one afternoon, his breath shallow but his grip firm, and told me that my strength would always come from refusing to bend. He handed me the key to the Lake Travis house and said, "You will need this, a place of your own, a place no one can take." The key was warm in my palm, and I held it long after he drifted into restless sleep. That small brass key felt heavier than any weapon I had carried in training because it symbolized trust, his trust, and I knew that trust came with a responsibility to fight. Randall and Linda saw it differently. The weeks after my father's passing were filled with tense conversations disguised as casual remarks. Randall suggested he could help manage the inheritance so I could focus on the army. Linda warned me that money could be dangerous in the wrong hands, implying mine. Chase scoffed openly when I reminded them that the will was clear. I learned to stop arguing because each word I spoke was twisted and turned against me. Instead, I listened, observed, and stored away their tactics. Every smirk, every dismissive wave of Randall's hand, every cold glance from Linda became data evidence of what I already knew: they would not stop. At school and on base, I built a different world. My fellow soldiers saw me as capable someone who could hold her ground during drills, someone who did not fold when exhaustion hit. My instructors at Fort Leonard Wood pushed me hard, but even their harshest commands felt like validation compared to the quiet cruelty of home. Among soldiers, I was respected. Among family, I was invisible. That contrast sharpened me. It taught me that respect could be earned in the right environment and denied in the wrong one, and it made me hunger for justice. Looking back now, I see how every detail prepared me for what happened at Arlington. The silence at dinners taught me how to withstand stares without flinching. The ridicule about playing soldier taught me how to turn insults into fuel. My father's fading breath taught me the value of trust and legacy. And the key to Lake Travis still in my possession reminded me that there was always a place where I could draw strength. When I walked into that funeral in my uniform, carrying grief and pride in equal measure, I already knew I was stepping into enemy territory. I just did not realize how quickly the battle would break open. Even so, a part of me still hoped. Hoped that grief might soften Linda, that ceremony might humble Randall, that death might remind Chase of something larger than himself. But hope died quickly under the weight of entitlement. They saw the inheritance not as my father's gift, but as their prize. And I, 19 years old, bruised but unbroken, was the wall they intended to tear down. My father had warned me in his way, had told me strength was refusing to bend. Now I understood why. The storm was always coming, and it had finally arrived. The third morning at Walter Reed began with the sound of my phone buzzing nonstop on the tray table. I reached for it slowly, every movement dragging pain through my ribs, and found dozens of unread messages, calls from numbers I did not recognize. Notifications stacked so high the screen blurred with them. Maya had already warned me the clip had gone viral, but until I saw it for myself, I had not realized the scale. News anchors debated my family dynamics like they were experts on grief. Headlines scrolled across the bottom of screens: Stepdad assaults soldier at Arlington funeral video, sparks national outrage. My name was everywhere. Emily Carson, 19 Army MP. My face pale and twisted in pain as Randall's fist drove into me, replayed again and again. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, but I could not look away. The story was no longer private. It had become a symbol, and that realization shifted something deep inside me. Fear began to burn into determination. Later that day, Colonel Whitaker came to see me again. He walked in with 2 officers from the Judge Advocate General's office, their presence crisp and deliberate. He did not waste time with sympathy. Instead, he laid a folder on the table beside my bed. "Carson," he said, "the Army is treating this seriously. You were assaulted during a funeral at Arlington of federal property, and that has consequences. JAG is coordinating with Arlington police, and the footage leaves no room for doubt." His eyes fixed on mine, steady and sharp. "The question is, do you want to pursue this publicly?" My throat tightened. Pursue. The word tasted like power and risk all at once. I glanced at Maya, who gave the smallest nod, and then I turned back to the colonel. "Yes, sir. I want every truth exposed." His jaw flexed the faintest sign of approval, and he told the lawyers to begin drafting motions. That moment, small in action but massive in weight, marked the shift. I was no longer simply the girl who had been hit. I was a soldier demanding justice. The rest of the day passed in waves of exhaustion and clarity. I drifted in and out of sleep, but each time I woke, I repeated my vow. This was not the end. Visitors trickled in: an older veteran who had served with my father, a church member from Texas, who looked at me with sorrow in her eyes, even a reporter who tried to slip past security before being escorted out. Each face reminded me that eyes were everywhere now, watching, waiting. And though the pressure threatened to suffocate me, it also kept me upright. If I folded, it would not just be me who paid. It would be every voice silenced at family tables, every daughter dismissed, every soldier doubted. That night, alone with the folded flag across my lap, I replayed the clip again. Randall's fist, the gasp, my body collapsing. I hated watching it, hated the way my pain was reduced to pixels, but I forced myself to see it, to burn it into memory. This was evidence. This was the turning point. They had tried to bury me under silence, but instead they had handed me the loudest weapon I could have asked for. The next morning, the hospital room felt smaller than ever, crowded, not by people, but by the weight of headlines. A nurse left the television on as she worked, and I watched in disbelief as my face filled the screen beside the Arlington gates. Commentators argued about inheritance laws, military respect, and family betrayal. One host called Randall's actions a disgrace to every veteran buried at Arlington. Another questioned why my mother had stood by in silence. Hearing strangers dissect the very fractures of my life made me want to curl inward. But then the camera cut to the clip again. Randall's fist my fall, the flag clutched in my arms, and something hardened inside me. They thought this would humiliate me. Instead, it exposed them. When Maya arrived with fresh coffee, she showed me her phone, the screen alive with messages from soldiers across bases nationwide. "Stay strong, Private Carson. We have your back. Boundaries are survival." Some came from women in uniform, others from men, but all carried the same undercurrent: solidarity. For the first time, I felt the breadth of support beyond Arlington, beyond Dallas. My story was no longer just mine. It was resonating, and that realization steadied me in ways medication could not. By midday, Colonel Whitaker returned, this time not alone, but with 2 representatives from the Department of Defense Public Affairs Office. Their presence was measured, their voices deliberate. They explained that the footage had already reached congressional staffers, that questions were being raised about how a soldier could be attacked so openly without immediate consequences. Their message was clear. Emily, you have leverage. If you choose to remain silent, this will fade. But if you speak, it will reshape the narrative. The thought both thrilled and terrified me. My ribs still ached with every breath my temple pulsed with stitches, but I nodded. I will speak. Not yet, not today, but when the time is right. They accepted that answer, leaving me with a folder of contacts and the weight of a choice that could alter everything. That evening, lying back against the stiff hospital pillows, I let the beeping of the monitors guide my breathing. I thought of my father's words of the key to Lake Travis, of the trust he had placed in me. Randall and Linda had tried to turn that trust into weakness, but the truth had turned it into armor. I whispered aloud, barely more than breath. They thought I would break. They do not understand. And as the words left my lips, I realized I had crossed an invisible line. I was no longer simply reacting. I was planning. The next chapter would not be theirs to dictate. It would be mine. The Mayflower Hotel shimmered that evening with chandeliers and polished marble floors, a stage Randall and Linda had chosen to preserve what remained of their social standing. They invited colleagues, distant relatives, and members of their church circle, hoping to spin the scandal into a misunderstanding and recast themselves as victims of an ungrateful daughter. I was not present in body, still recovering at Walter Reed, but my name filled the room like smoke. Guests whispered as waiters carried trays of wine, their voices low yet cutting. I heard she struck first. I heard she planned it. I heard the stepfather was only protecting the mother. Lies spread like oil, slick and hard to contain, but beneath the hum of conversation there was unease. Too many had seen the clip with their own eyes, the blow, the collapse, the flag slipping from my arms. Truth had already taken root. Randall, in his pressed navy suit, strutted between tables, insisting his version of the story would stand. Linda followed closely, her smile brittle, her pearls trembling against her throat each time she raised her glass to toast resilience. Chase leaned in corners, whispering to friends from his ROTC program as though his own future was not dangling by a thread. They believed they were still in control. They believed money and posture would shield them. What they did not know was that Colonel James Whitaker had chosen that night to arrive with authority no one could ignore. At 8 o'clock, the doors at the far end opened and the air shifted. Conversations stuttered into silence as Whitaker entered in full dress uniform, flanked by 2 JAG lawyers carrying slim briefcases and 2 officers from the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department. The room froze. Randall's glass of bourbon trembled against its rim. Linda's smile collapsed into a line. Guests glanced between one another, sensing history tilting beneath their feet. Whitaker did not shout. He did not need to. His voice carried with the weight of command when he spoke. This evening is not about family. It is about truth. He explained with precision that the estate left by my father was legally protected, that every document confirmed my sole ownership of the inheritance and the Lake Travis property. The JAG lawyers placed files on the head table, their pages marked with seals and signatures undeniable. He continued clarifying that the assault at Arlington was not a private matter, but a criminal act, subject to local jurisdiction and federal oversight. The 2 police officers stepped forward, their presence a reminder that consequences had already begun. Murmurs swept the room, some guests shifting uncomfortably, others pulling out their phones to record. Then the screen at the far wall lowered, the projector humming to life. Guests expected a montage of wedding photos or family smiles. Instead, the video from Arlington filled the space, the sound of bugle taps still echoing as Randall's fist drove into my chest and my body collapsed against the stone wall. Gasps filled the ballroom. Some clutched their mouths. Others whispered prayers. No one could look away. When the screen went black, silence reigned. Whitaker spoke again, steady as steel. "This is not rumor. This is not family drama. This is evidence." And as his words settled over the crowd, I felt even from miles away that the tide had turned. Randall's face flushed deep red as the final frame of the video lingered on the blank screen. He stumbled to his feet, words tumbling out in fragments about alcohol, about misunderstanding, about me provoking him. But the excuses dissolved under the sheer weight of eyes staring, recording, judging. Linda tried to reclaim the stage. her voice sharp and desperate, insisting I had always been difficult, that I was poisoned by military culture, that a daughter should sacrifice for her family. Her rant rang hollow in the silence that followed. Whitaker's gaze did not waver. He reminded them that family does not excuse violence, that blood is not licensed to steal or to strike. The JAG lawyers added clarity, citing statutes and regulations explaining that coercion of a soldier's assets was not only immoral, but prosecutable. One of the D.C. officers stepped forward, confirming that Randall was under active investigation for assault at Arlington. A ripple of shock spread across the tables. Some guests who had arrived eager to defend the Pierces shifted in their seats, unwilling to be linked to a sinking ship. Others whispered in disgust, shaking their heads as the facade crumbled. Then Whitaker raised his hand, and the ballroom fell silent again. His words cut clean, Emily. Carson is not here to defend herself because she is still recovering in a military hospital. She is a soldier who stood in uniform at her father's grave and was struck down for daring to say no. That is what you witnessed. That is what the world has seen. His declaration cracked through the air like thunder, and for the first time, Randall sagged in his chair shoulders, folding inward as though the weight of inevitability had finally landed. Linda's eyes darted wildly from guest to guest, searching for sympathy and finding none. Chase stared at the floor, his ROTC friends quietly edging away the future he had boasted about slipping like sand through his fingers. The ballroom was no longer theirs. It belonged to Truth. Guests began murmuring, some pulling out phones to sign their names as witnesses, others nodding grimly at the lawyers who moved through the crowd with forms. The projector flickered back on, not to repeat the violence, but to display the will and estate documents with my name etched clearly as sole beneficiary. No one could deny it now. The property was mine. The inheritance was mine. The right to say no was mine. The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded, the kind of silence that comes when illusions are shattered beyond repair. And though I was miles away, stitched and bruised in Walter Reed, I felt that silence fill me with something fierce and steady. For the first time, Randall and Linda had no script to control, no lies strong enough to smother the truth, and for the first time, the people around them saw exactly who they were. By the next morning, the ripple had become a storm. News anchors across networks replayed the clip from Arlington with bold captions stretched across the screen. Stepdad strikes Army soldier at father's funeral. Commentators spoke of betrayal, entitlement, and violence in sacred spaces. Some panels invited veterans who shook their heads in disgust, saying the act dishonored not only my father, but every service member buried at Arlington. Others discussed the legal implications, pointing out that this was no longer a family dispute, but a matter of assault under both civilian and federal jurisdiction. My phone on the hospital tray buzzed endlessly with alerts. Colleagues from Fort Leonard Wood sent messages of support commanders reminding me that my chain of command stood firmly behind me. Even strangers reached out, mothers writing that they saw their daughters in me, veterans, saying they wished their own families had defended their services fiercely. For once, I was not invisible. Randall and Linda tried to fight back with statements through their lawyer. They claimed I had exaggerated the incident, that the video was taken out of context, that alcohol and grief had muddled the truth. But no one believed them. The footage was too clear. The silence of the guests in that ballroom was too damning. Within 48 hours, CNN ran an investigative piece digging into Randall's company. Contracts with the Army Corps of Engineers were suddenly in question. Former employees spoke of bullying, of corner-cutting, of threats behind closed doors. Investors pulled out, citing reputational risk. The company's website went dark for maintenance and never returned. Linda fared no better. At her church in Dallas, members who once admired her pearls and polished smile turned away. Social media posts she wrote blaming me for ruining Lily's wedding were screenshot, mocked, and shared with captions like, "This is where the cruelty started." By the end of the week, she had deactivated her accounts. Chase's fall was sharper still. His ROTC instructors suspended him, citing conduct unbecoming after his presence in the viral footage. The friends who once orbited his bravado distanced themselves, unwilling to be dragged into scandal. He called my phone once, his voice cracking with anger and desperation, accusing me of destroying the family name. I hung up. The truth was, he had destroyed himself by standing silent while violence unfolded inches away. Through all of it, I remained in the hospital ribs, bound, head still throbbing, but inside me something steadier grew. I watched the empire that had tried to erase me crumble under the weight of evidence they themselves had provided. Every headline was another reminder that boundaries had consequences, and that for once those consequences did not fall on me. The second week after Arlington, the consequences hardened into reality. Randall was arrested by the D.C. Metropolitan Police for assault, escorted from his office in front of cameras that caught every step of his stagger. The image of him shielding his face with a briefcase ran on front pages nationwide. The charges were clear and public, and when paired with the military's cooperation through JAG, there was no room left for negotiation. He made bail, of course, but the damage was done. Contracts evaporated overnight. A multi-million-dollar bid he had pushed for with the Corps of Engineers was officially terminated with a single line due to reputational harm. I read that line in the Washington Post while still hooked to monitors, and it felt like vindication written in black ink. Linda retreated into whispers. Friends stopped answering her calls, neighbors turned away in grocery aisles, and even her closest circle of church acquaintances issued a statement of disappointment. She tried to host a dinner to prove she was still standing, but only 2 people arrived and both left early, unable to endure her denial. The power she once wielded with a tilt of her chin was gone. Chase tried to salvage his future begging ROTC leadership for a second chance, insisting he had been misled. But video stills showing him smirking in the background at Arlington told a different story. The suspension became permanent. He posted angry messages online blaming me, but the responses were brutal. Strangers reminded him that silence in the face of violence is complicity. He deleted his accounts within days. Meanwhile, the support flowing toward me became overwhelming. Veterans groups sent letters, survivor organizations offered legal guidance. Even members of Congress released statements condemning what had happened. My inbox filled with voices I had never met, thanking me for refusing to be silenced. At night, when pain kept me awake, I scrolled through those messages and felt less alone than I ever had in my own family's house. The irony never left me. Randall and Linda had tried to strip me of my inheritance, convinced that control would silence me. Instead, their greed handed me the one thing I had lacked: undeniable proof. And that proof had become the hammer that shattered their standing. By the end of the month, Randall faced not only criminal charges but also civil suits from former employees emboldened by his collapse. Linda lived in the shadow of scandal. Her social ties dissolved her reputation unrecognizable. Chase drifted without direction. And me, the girl they called selfish, lay in a hospital bed healing but stronger than ever. I had survived their fists, their lies, and their schemes. They had lost everything they thought untouchable. And for the first time in my life, I felt the weight shift completely. I was not the forgotten daughter anymore. I was the one still standing. The day I left Walter Reed, the air outside felt sharper than I remembered, crisp against my skin, carrying a weight of freedom I had not tasted in weeks. My ribs still ached with each breath, and the stitches tugged when I turned my head too fast, but the sky above was endless and unbroken, and I promised myself I would never shrink under anyone's shadow again. I traveled south to Texas, back to the Lake Travis house my father had left me, the house Randall and Linda had tried to steal with lies and fists. The drive up the winding roads was quiet, each turn revealing the lake's silver stretch beneath the afternoon sun. When I parked in the driveway and stepped onto the deck, I felt the tension in my chest ease for the first time since Arlington. This place was mine, not because of inheritance papers or bank accounts, but because every corner of it carried the echo of my father's belief in me. Inside, I changed the locks, a symbolic act as much as a practical one. The locksmith recognized me immediately from the footage, his hands steady as he installed the new hardware. When he handed me the keys, he looked me in the eye and said, "You did the right thing." Those words stayed with me long after he left. I walked through each room slowly, fingers brushing along the walls, imagining the gatherings that would never happen with Randall at the head of the table or Linda dictating the menu. Their absence was a gift. This house would no longer be a battleground. It would be a sanctuary. At night, the lake reflected the moonlight in ripples that seemed to whisper of resilience. I journaled daily, pouring out the pain, the anger, the memories of Arlington until the words began to shift toward something new: hope, purpose, strength. I framed a photograph of my father in uniform and placed it on the mantel above the fireplace. Each time I looked at it, I remembered his voice telling me to stand tall, to trust my own judgment, to never let anyone reduce me. Work called sooner than I expected. Colonel Whitaker reached out, reminding me that while I had the right to take time, my place in the Army was waiting. I returned to Fort Leonard Wood weeks later, still bruised, but walking straighter, determined to prove that the violence had not broken me. My fellow MPs greeted me with a mix of respect and camaraderie. Maya hugged me fiercely, whispering, "You showed them all." And I realized then that my story had spread far beyond my own circle. It had become a lesson whispered in barracks and classrooms that boundaries matter, that strength is not selfishness, that silence is never the answer. In the months that followed, I created a small scholarship in my father's name for young women entering the military. The first recipient wrote me a letter saying she felt less alone, knowing someone had paved the path before her. I wept as I read it, not from sorrow, but from the recognition that my pain had been transformed into purpose. At Lake Travis, I hosted fellow soldiers for long weekends, offering them the peace of dawn coffee on the deck, the laughter of evenings by the water. The house that Randall had tried to seize became a place of healing, not just for me, but for others. News of Randall's downfall trickled in steadily. His company dissolved piece by piece, contracts canceled, lawsuits mounting. Linda remained in Dallas isolated and bitter, her name spoken in whispers tinged with pity. Chase drifted further into obscurity, his ROTC dreams permanently shattered. I did not gloat. Their collapse was not my victory. It was their consequence. My victory was quieter, steadier. It was the ability to wake each morning without dread, to choose how to spend my hours, to honor my father by living fully. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and painted the water gold, I stood on the deck holding the folded flag that had once been heavy in my arms at Arlington. I unfolded it gently, letting it ripple in the breeze before placing it on a pole by the water. The sight of it flying proud and unbroken filled me with a calm I had never known. They had tried to bury me under shame and fists and lies. Instead, I had taken root stronger than before. Looking back now, I see the night of Arlington not as an ending, but as a beginning. The moment Randall struck me was the moment I stopped allowing others to script my life. The hospital lights, the headlines, the collapse of their empire, all of it led me here to a place where I finally understood the difference between blood and family, between silence and survival. Family is not the people who share your name. It is the people who respect your boundaries. It is the people who stand beside you when the world tilts. So when I speak now, I do not speak with shame or bitterness. I speak with clarity. Boundaries are not selfish. They are the line that keeps us human. Abuse is not love. Silence is not peace. And survival is not weakness, it is proof of strength. If you have ever been told to surrender what is yours for the sake of family harmony, if you have ever been silenced by the weight of expectations, hear me when I say this. Your dignity is not negotiable. Your peace is not disposable. And your life belongs to you. When I look back on that day at Arlington, I no longer see only the violence or the betrayal. I see the moment my life shifted from silence to strength. My stepfather thought a raised fist would erase me. My mother thought complicity would control me. But what they created instead was evidence undeniable and permanent that abuse thrives only when no one speaks. For years, I had been told that family came first, that sacrifice was duty, that boundaries were selfish. But lying in that hospital bed, bandages tied across my temple, I finally understood the truth. Boundaries are not selfish. They are survival. It has taken time to heal. The bruises faded faster than the echoes of my mother's voice, insisting I stay quiet, faster than the sting of whispers calling me ungrateful. But each scar has become a reminder not of weakness, but of resilience. Every morning when I stand on the deck at Lake Travis with coffee in my hands and the flag flying against the sunrise, I remind myself that peace is earned by refusing to surrender dignity. The inheritance my father left me was not just money or property. It was the chance to live without compromise, the freedom to choose myself. If you are listening to this, and you have ever been pressured to give up what is yours in the name of family, know this: you are not alone. If you have ever been struck silenced or shamed for daring to say no, hear my voice when I tell you that survival is not weakness. It is proof of strength, and respect is the only foundation that makes family real. Blood without respect is nothing more than control disguised as love. I share this not to ask for pity, but to offer solidarity, because too many people are still told that blood excuses abuse, that silence protects harmony, that sacrifice is the price of belonging. It is not. Belonging without respect is a cage, and silence only feeds the cruelty. Sometimes the bravest act is not to stay, but to walk away, to build your own sanctuary, to trust that the world will meet you with allies where your family did not. So I ask you, the ones listening now, what would you have done in that ballroom, in that cemetery, in that hospital bed? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have drawn the line? If you believe boundaries matter, type the word boundaries in the comments. Tell me where you are listening from, because it matters to me that these stories reach people everywhere who know what it means to fight for dignity. And if you have a story of your own, share it. Speaking aloud breaks the silence that allows cruelty to grow. I was once the overlooked daughter, the quiet one, the soldier who thought her voice did not count. Now I know better. I am the woman who said no, who survived fists and lies, who stood firm when they tried to bury her. And I am still here. Your peace is not negotiable, your dignity is not disposable, and your life belongs to you, not to those who would take it for their comfort. Choose yourself.